Well, it's great to be here to share a bit of information about our efforts to improve the estimation of COVID mortality disparities across race groups in the U.S. As we all know, COVID has been, excuse me, deadlier for persons of color than for non-Hispanic whites. And while this finding reflects the pattern seen, excuse me, for other health outcomes for persons of color in this country, we remain unclear about the true extent or the specific causal pathway for this excess mortality. To get closer to the answer, it will help to have mortality rates that are more meaningful than the crude rates that we often see in the media or in the COVID data. The problem is that crude rates provide no context. What we want are adjusted rates that account for the variability of mortality risk across different levels of certain key population attributes, thus removing those attributes as main predictors and freeing us up to consider other causes. I'll give you two quick non-COVID examples to show why this is useful. Let's take Japan and Mexico, two countries with nearly the same size of population. In 2018, the crude all-cause death rate was 1,100 per 100,000 persons in Japan versus only 600 in Mexico. It would be premature, however, to conclude that Japan poses nearly twice the risk to one's survival as Mexico, because we haven't accounted for the fact that older people are inherently at higher risk of dying than younger people, and the fact that older adults make up a much larger share of Japan's population than they do Mexico's, as we can see here with these population pyramids. When you adjust for differing age structures, the two countries' death rates become much more comparable. Now, we can apply this principle to the geographic distribution of a population as well. Imagine, if you will, a very small county with 1,300 residents, 200 Black, 1,100 white. And in this county, there are 11 Black deaths and 20 white deaths, which works out to a crude death rate that is 3 times higher for Blacks than it is for whites. We would perhaps be tempted to conclude from this that there's a significant disadvantage, mortality disadvantage for Blacks in this county. But what if I tell you now that there is a town in this county, and in town, the mortality rate is 10%. Outside of town, the mortality rate is 1%. And these rates are the same regardless of race. So at either level of geography here, rural or urban, Blacks and whites have the same mortality. But the twist here is that a much higher share of Blacks live in the place with the high death rate than whites. So half of the Blacks in this county live in town, whereas less than a tenth of whites do. It's because of situations like this that we can obtain crude death rates that are misleading. Now, to bring this back to COVID, our goal was to estimate mortality risks that could be compared across race and ethnic groups and would not be confounded by age structure or geographic distributions, and to do so in a way that would work with the CDC's and the National Center of Health Statistics rather limited professional COVID death data. For the sake of time, I'll go pass over the methodological details, but I'll suffice to say that we did work out a way to make this work. And that involves indirectly standardizing death counts for each race and ethnic group against the death counts for non-Hispanic whites, and then creating standardized mortality ratios from those results to enable comparisons. Now, let's put it this way, the bottom line is that adjustment makes a considerable difference. This plot shows the relative risk of a COVID-19 related death by race or ethnic group, well, for two groups, relative to non-Hispanic whites, who are represented by the risk ratio of 1.0. So they're the reference group, standard 1 level, or the non-Hispanic whites represent the denominator in this ratio. Let's I'll say also that this data is based on 1,100 counties from across the U.S. Cumulative deaths counted up through October 10th. With no adjustment, Blacks show a risk of dying from COVID that's 70% higher than for whites. And for Hispanics and Latinx, it is an excess mortality that's 20% higher. If you adjust for geographic distribution of the population, excess mortality risk actually vanishes for Hispanics, and it drops by over half for Blacks. And this is a positive thing. And we suspect that this is because these two groups, Blacks and Hispanics, may be more concentrated in the counties and cities where we find the highest COVID caseloads and the highest numbers of COVID deaths. And by contrast, if we adjust for age structure alone, we find that excess mortality for both of these groups is now 3 times higher, almost 3 times as high as for whites. And we can attribute this to the fact that both Blacks and Hispanics have age distributions that are younger than for non-Hispanic whites. So that is all well and good, but the point is that neither of these adjustments on their own tells the whole story. If you control for both age and place, the results now start to become a little more meaningful. Here we see that Blacks and Hispanics both have twice the risk of a COVID-related death relative to whites. And we also know now that we cannot look to age or place to explain this disparity. That gives us the ability to put the spotlight onto other more plausible causes, such as, for example, the prevalence of pre-existing conditions in the case of Blacks. But perhaps even more interesting is what these standardized results tell us in a comparison context. As troubling as the Black excess mortality rate here is, the Hispanic and Latinx excess mortality rate being the same as the non-Hispanic Black rate is actually perhaps even more concerning, given the fact that Hispanics started out at a better position relative to Blacks in the crude rates. And also because of the Hispanic paradox. So for those who are interested or who are researching why COVID mortality varies by race in the US, the Hispanic situation now suddenly becomes a lot more, I don't want to use the word interesting, but there's a story happening here that would, for some reason, Hispanics are being appear to be hit especially hard. Relatively speaking, they're being hit harder than non-Hispanic Blacks, and that's the kind of conclusion that does not become apparent until you control for age and for place. So at this time, we've identified a few avenues of interest to carry this work forward. The longitudinal trend is interesting. For example, the data that I just showed you for October 10th is quite different than the same outcomes for data cumulative to, say, mid-May. We also believe that there's an important story to reveal regarding the regarding outcomes at the state level, because at any given time, the mortality risk ratios for Blacks or Hispanics have been wildly different across states in the US. They aggregate into the numbers you see here, but when you disaggregate them at the state level, they are wildly different. And we strongly believe that there's something going on there that needs to be understood.
Sorry to interrupt. We only have like 3.5 minutes for the discussion. So
oh gosh, I am okay. So
yeah,
I'm actually done here. We do have a medRxiv preprint that contains their methodology. Fastest way to find it: Google Goldstein Atherwood medRxiv. Thank you.